Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture for merging, joining, and concatenating data frames. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to combine data frames through a variety of methods. Instead of actually live coding everything out, since these methods and commands are actually really simple, and most of the typing is just actually creating the data frames to merge or join together, what we're going to do is just walk through the lecture notebook for this lecture. It's called Merging, Joining, and Concatenating, and it's under the Pandas folder. Let's go ahead and jump to that Jupyter notebook now. Alright, here we are at the Jupyter notebook for merging, joining, and concatenating. First off, we're going to create some example data frames to work with. Here, I've imported pandas as PD, and using a dictionary and a list of index numbers, I've created three data frames, df1, df2, and df3. If we take a look at these data frames, we'll see that we have df1, which is columns A, B, C, and D, and indexes 0 through 3. And then df2 has the same columns except the indices are 4 through 7, and then df3 has the indices 8 through 11. Let's talk about concatenation. Concatenation basically glues together the data frames. Keep in mind that the dimensions should match along the axis you're trying to concatenate on. For this, you just use pd.concat and then pass in a list of the data frames to concatenate together. Here, I'm going to concatenate data frames 1, 2, and 3 by passing them into a list into the pd.concat function. Here we can see that by default, the axis to join on is 0, meaning it's going to join the rows together. And we see here that this successfully concatenated, or basically glued together, the data frames. And we can see now we have A, B, and C, and D as columns, with the indices 0 all the way up to 11, with each of the data points lining up nicely. Now you can also specify axis is equal to 1 if you wanted to join and merge along the columns, or concatenate along the columns. And this is an example of what happens when you use pd.concat on these three data frames along axis is equal to 1. Notice here we have a bunch of missing values, and that's because these data frames didn't have values for all the indices that you wanted to concatenate on. For example, with data frame 1, A, B, and C, and D, you had index values for 0 through 3. However, for 4 all the way up to 11, you had no values, and that's why it filled it in with nulls when you joined this or concatenated it on data frame 2 and data frame 3. Which basically means when you're working with concatenation and pd.concat, you'll want to make sure that you have information lining up correctly when you join on the axes. In this case, we wanted to join on axis equals 0 to line everything up correctly. Had we specified to join along the columns with axis equal to 1, we'll have a bunch of missing information. Most often, you'll probably be joining columns together, so you'll in fact be joining along axis is equal to 1. However, make sure you know your data and what you actually want to concatenate before choosing an axis. Alright, let's go ahead and move along. We'll create some more example data frames, in this case, one called left and one called right. Here, if we take a look at left, we have columns A and B with some values in them, and then we have a key column, K0 through K3. We have a right data frame, which is a very similar data frame except it has different columns, C and D. However, the key column is exactly the same as the left. So we have a left data frame and a right data frame. Pandas is capable of using the merge function to do merge logic that's very similar to merging SQL tables together. And if you don't work with SQL, you don't have to worry too much about this, but I'll show you the basics of how to merge two data frames. You just say pd.merge and then pass in the left data frame and the right data frame, or just pass in data frame 1 or data frame 2, whatever data frames you want to merge together. By default, it will merge them on inner, and if you're unfamiliar with inner as regards to SQL merging, don't worry about it, just use the default inner. More importantly, learn about this on. Basically, when you're merging, you're going to want to merge on a key column, and you can actually pass in one or more key columns, which we'll see later. But basically, what's happening here is we're going to combine or merge these data frames together on this key column. And that way, instead of concatenating them, we would have two key columns. We can merge so that we merge them or join them on the same key column that they share. So the logic here is when you're using pd.merge, instead of just gluing the data frames together, you're going to see where the values match up on columns, in this case the key column, and then create the rows using that key column. Let me go ahead and show you a couple more complicated examples. Here I have left and right data frames, and we'll notice here that they have two keys, key 1 and key 2. Otherwise, they're exactly the same as the left and right we just saw earlier. You can use pd.merge, just pass in the first data frame and the second data frame, and then you can specify on, and you can pass in a list of keys if you want to actually merge on multiple keys, such as key 1 or key 2. And here are some more examples using merge outer or merge right. Now, if you're not familiar with SQL syntax such as inner, outer, right, or left joins, don't worry about this too much. We don't actually use these in the course. We will always default to something that looks like this in the course, where we just use an inner join. However, if you find yourself trying to do these sort of SQL merging and you're already familiar with SQL syntax, just know that Pandas has this how operator or parameter for you to use in case you want that extra functionality. But basically, depending if you're using outer, right, inner, etc., you may find that you have some missing values. Just keep that in mind as you're working with pd.merge. Here's an example of left. And finally, we've arrived at joining. Joining is a convenient method for combining the columns of two potentially differently indexed data frames into a single resulting data frame. You can essentially think of this as the same thing as merge, except the keys you want to join on are actually on your index instead of a column. So here I've created two data frames, left and right. Notice they have columns A, B, and then C, D, and then the index is actually the keys we're going to join on. And the syntax you can use is say left.join right, and it will automatically do an inner join between the left and the right based off of the index keys. If you wanted to merge these two data frames based off of one of their columns, you'd have to use merge. But the join method functionality comes off of one of the data frames. You say .join and then pass in the other data frame. And just like merge, you can specify how, such as inner, left, outer, etc. And remember, this is only for advanced SQL users who are already familiar with that terminology. If you're unfamiliar with that, don't worry about it too much. Let's go ahead and do a quick review of how to join, merge, and concatenate data frames, and we'll go over the key topics you should get out of this lecture. As far as merging, joining, and concatenating data frames, in order to concatenate or glue data frames together, the process is quite simple. You just say pd.concat and you pass in a list of your data frames. And then you make sure to specify the correct axis, depending if you want to join them together by their rows or by their columns. Next, you have pd.merge, and pd.merge allows you to merge data frames together, and you just pass in your first data frame you want to merge, and then your second data frame you want to merge, and then you say on, and you can pass in just a single column key, or you can pass in a list of keys, and by default, it will merge on inner. If you're unfamiliar with merging SQL tables, don't worry about this how too much. Just worry about one data frame on the left, one data frame on the right, and then on a certain key column or on a list of key columns. That's really the only functionality with PD merge that we'll be using throughout the course. And then for joining is a more advanced method for combining columns of two potentially differently indexed data frames. It's very similar to merge, except that you're actually joining on the index instead of a column. And the syntax for that is just the name of the left data frame dot join on the right. We actually won't be using join throughout the course, but I want you to be aware of it, and you can reference this notebook or the documentation in case you ever want to review joining. All right, great job, thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture.